Hey everyone! So, for my adolescent developmental assessment, I will be observing my younger brother James. He's 17 years old and he's a junior in high school, and he's the baby of our family. So, it goes James, who's 17, my sister Maggie, who's 19, I'm 21, and then my older brother Thomas is 22. So, we're all very close in age. James was born with a cancerous tumor, which was immediately removed, but since then his cancer has came back 5 times between the ages of 18 months and 11 years old. So he's gone through surgeries and chemotherapy, radiation, basically all the hospitalization you can think of. And all of that has greatly affected James's development. However, since being cancer free, his development has continued to progress, and he would be considered happy and healthy and typically developing at this stage. In terms of physical development, James is a little different from what you would generally think of when you think of a teenage boy, because he's much smaller than the average due to chemotherapy and different medications that have stunted his growth. Within the last year or two, he's experienced a major growth spurt due to puberty. However, he is currently 5'1" and he's around 100-ish pounds. He also has experienced increases in motor development with puberty in terms of getting stronger and faster. When observing all of these changes, it's important to notice how puberty and the timing of all of it can affect adolescents' body image. For James, he's always been the smallest one in his class, so he was always used to it. However, as of recently, I've observed how body image and self-esteem are linked. Whenever school dances roll around, James gets nervous because a lot of the girls in his grade are taller than him, and he's self-conscious of going to the dance being shorter than his date. He's very aware of the differences in his body size between himself and his classmates. As he's tried to figure out his own self-identity, I can tell that this is something he struggles with. If I were working with a patient like James in the hospital, there are many ways in which I could assess his physical development. Since puberty, body image, and self-esteem are closely related, I could help lead an activity with James that intertwines those three topics. Since James has experience in the hospital before, I could have him bring in a picture of himself from the ages at which he was previously hospitalized. So for him, this would be ages 18 months, 5, 7, 9, and 11 years old, and then take a photo of him now. We could then arrange them in order and have James describe himself at each of those ages, with the primary focus on himself now. For example, he could describe how he stayed the same height between the ages 7 and 9 years old, but he had a major growth spurt between 11 and 17 years old. I think this activity would be important because I know James is often self-conscious when he compares his physical development to that of his peers. However, this activity gets him to shift his focus away from his peers and observe the personal growth that he's made. I also think it would be a good indicator to assess his self-esteem throughout puberty by observing the type of languages he uses when referring to himself, either positively or negatively. Throughout adolescence, the brain goes through many changes and increases in cognitive functioning. With teenagers, this could be assessed in the hospital through procedure preparation. For example, during this time, working memory increases, enabling more information to be held in the mind at once. Another change is in their attention span, which allows them to be more selective on relevant information and flexible to adapt to changing demands. Through procedure prep, this could be observed in the way in which teenager is comprehending the information. For example, because of the increase in working memory and attention, the teenager might want to hear all the information about the procedure at once rather than having it in chunks. This could also be observed through the questions that they ask leading up to a procedure as they begin to better understand what they're experiencing. So this could be demonstrated through asking why questions or more complex questions. So being observant of the ways in which they think and ask questions will allow you to see how they're developing cognitively. I can observe James's social development through his relationships with his peers. This is observed through his friendships and the crowds he's around. James's friends are the close group of kids that he enjoys being with and spends most time with. The book mentions that close friends improve an individual's attitudes towards school, and this is definitely true for James. When he talks about his classes that he likes, he talks about how he enjoys the classes solely because his friends are in it with him rather than the actual class itself. He also is a part of the athletic or sports crowd at school because he's the basketball manager and plays golf, so the crowd that he's involved in is other kids who are also involved in sports. Hospitalization can greatly affect social development at any age, but especially in adolescence, because this is a time where they want to be connected to their peers at all times. Because of this, it's important that throughout hospitalization, social development is continually stimulated, or the teenager will begin to isolate themselves. If I was assessing a patient like James in the hospital, I would see if he wanted to invite his friends to come visit him. So, in order to assess his social development, I would observe the ways in which they interact. Positive friendships in adolescence lead to positive social development. These friendships can be marked by helping young people deal with the stresses of adolescence, opportunities to develop a deep understanding of one another, and improving attitudes and involvement towards school. Because of this, rather than observing the way in which he interacts with his friends, he's going to want privacy. I could ask him questions after the visit about what he likes about his friends, what he likes doing with his friends, that sort of thing. If these are all positive responses, I can tell James is maintaining positive social development throughout hospitalization. When assessing James's emotional development, I would categorize him on the identity achievement category for paths to identity. Throughout middle school and early adolescence, James went through a period of self-exploration where he wasn't fully committed to one thing. For example, he tried many different sports, but he couldn't seem to find one that he was good at and that he liked. However, the varsity basketball team asked him to be a manager freshman year, and he's been doing that ever since. He loves being a part of the team and getting to be with his friends. Because of this, he's decided that he wants to manage a basketball team in college and eventually go on to be a head coach post-college. He's been starting to tour smaller colleges and meeting with different basketball coaches to try and achieve his goal. This demonstrates that he's in the identity achievement path because he started with exploration and now is committed to his values and goals. While James currently seems to be on the path of identity achievement, hospitalization is something that could hinder this development. Hospitalization could affect the way in which he views himself and his abilities, so he might feel like he needs to revert back to a time of exploration in order to understand his values and goals for his future. Having this conversation with James by asking about his future would allow me to understand where he is at in terms of emotional development and how he's been affected by hospitalization. Since he knows he wants to attend a small college, I could assist him in looking for colleges that match his needs so that he can begin to gain a sense of confidence in himself and what he wants to pursue. According to Piaget, James would be in the formal operational stage. This is when teenagers develop the capacity for abstract, systematic, and scientific thinking. A big aspect in which I've noticed this kind of thinking with James is when he's discussing sports. Being from Iowa, my family and I are very big Iowa State fans. James is always calculating Iowa State's rankings in the Big 12 Conference in comparison to the other teams in the league. For example, towards the end of the football season, he starts to calculate what it would take for Iowa State to finish at a given place in the conference. To do this, he'll start looking at the teams and arrange them based on wins, losses, and schedules. I even get confused hearing him talk, but he'll have it down to a science, saying things like, if Iowa State beats Texas this weekend and Oklahoma loses to TCU, then TCU drops to third place and Iowa State could move up and tie for second, or like something crazy like that. But this demonstrates his hypothetic deductive reasoning, which describes how when James is faced with a problem, he can make predictions about variables that might affect outcomes, such as wins and losses of various teams. With hospitalization, it is important for teenagers to have age and developmentally appropriate quote-unquote play or interactions, because while they don't play like they used to as kids, teenagers still benefit from social gatherings or entertainment. So one way to entertain a teenager while also assessing their formal operational thought would be through a magic show. Magicians often come to children's hospitals and put on performances for the kids on the unit. One feature of formal operational thought is the ability to make inferences and draw conclusions based on the information presented, even if it's something the individual hasn't experienced themselves. For example, when watching The Magician, the teenager may begin to try and figure out the trick. Even if they don't know specifically how it was done, they can begin to predict and draw conclusions based on what they previously know and what they observed through the show. Lastly, according to Erikson, James would be in the identity versus role confusion stage. Erikson believed that if young people's earlier conflicts were resolved negatively, or if society limited their choices to ones that do not match their abilities and desires, they are likely to appear shallow, directionless, and unprepared for the challenges of adulthood. In terms of his identity and role confusion, James struggles when it comes to his identity involving his health. So he attended a week-long summer camp that was dedicated solely to kids with cancer. However, he only went for 2 years, and he decided that because he's been cancer free for the last 6 years, that he doesn't really feel like a quote unquote cancer kid anymore, as he says. However, he has recognized that he has many lifelong medical complications that he will have to deal with due to hospitalization when he was younger. So he also struggles to feel like, again in quotes, a normal kid. So for James, this has been interesting because he feels like he's juggling two separate roles in his life, although he tries to keep his medical side hidden. My parents are really encouraging James to experiment and try to get more comfortable with who he is. For example, they encouraged him to tell one of his best friends at school about some of his medical challenges so that James feels more comfortable when he wants to go hang out with this friend or spend the night at this friend's house. So while this might seem like a little step, identity development is so important because it's a crucial step towards becoming a productive and content adult. Because the teenage years are marked by many changes and transitions, it can be difficult for them to understand who they are. When teenagers are faced with hospitalization, their identity can become even more unclear because it can make them feel isolated or different from their peers. If I was working with a patient like James, there are many ways I could assess his identity versus role confusion stage. One way to observe would be through making an art collage with the prompt, "Who are you?" So he could use magazines or pictures to form the collage. But this is important because rather than focusing on the confusing parts of his identity, such as the question of asks, "I'm not a cancer kid anymore, but I don't feel like a normal kid," James could rather focus on his own identities that he knows to be true and solidified. So for him, this could be looks like something about being a son, a younger brother, being a sports lover, those sort of things, those parts of his identity that he knows to be true.